The Golden Gate Bridge is one of the most celebrated structures on Earth. The official story is pure triumph, visionary engineering, a Depression-era marvel. But 30 men went to work on this bridge and never came home, crushed by falling steel, swept into freezing currents, or sent plunging through a safety net that was supposed to save them. Most people don't know their names. Almost no one talks about the single morning in February 1937 when 10 of them were killed in a matter of seconds. To understand how the Golden Gate became one of America's deadliest construction sites, you have to start with why anyone was desperate enough to build it in the first place. Ferries once dominated the Golden Gate, carrying cars and commuters through fog and wind between San Francisco and Marin County. By the 1920s, these ferries were overwhelmed. Traffic clogged both shores, and Marin's farmland remained isolated. San Francisco's growth stalled, hemmed in by water and unreliable crossings. For city leaders and Marin landowners, the bottleneck threatened the region's future. Behind closed doors, interests collided. Ferry operators, fearing the end of their monopoly, lobbied Sacramento to protect their tolls. Marin land speculators saw opportunity, urging officials to back a bridge that could transform empty hills into thriving suburbs. In 1916, Marin's Board of Supervisors endorsed the idea, hoping a bridge would unlock real estate value and boost tax revenue. For San Francisco, the bridge offered a way out of economic stagnation, especially after the 1929 crash left the city desperate for jobs and investment. Obstacles mounted. The War Department controlled military land at both ends of the strait and raised concerns. Naval commanders demanded a clearance of at least 220 feet to keep the Pacific Fleet unimpeded, forcing planners to rethink the design and driving up costs. The project, already daunting, grew more complex. Momentum shifted in 1923 with the passage of the Coombs Bill by the California legislature. This law established the Golden Gate Bridge and Highway District, a public agency empowered to issue bonds and collect tolls. With Amedeo Giannini of Bank of America lending support, the district secured a $35 million bond, less than half the original estimate, but enough to begin. The bond's terms were strict, principal and interest payments due every quarter, with no room for delay. Any setback could scare off investors and collapse the financing, putting enormous pressure on the district to deliver on schedule. Every decision was shadowed by financial risk. The district's charter promised that tolls would cover all debts, but the math relied on bold traffic projections. If the bridge didn't open on time, or if weather slowed construction, the fallout could ripple across the region. The men who would eventually build the bridge did so, knowing that progress demanded speed, precision, and little margin for error. The Golden Gate Strait is less a stretch of water than a gauntlet. At its narrowest point, the channel plunges over 300 feet, deep enough to swallow a 30-story building. The seabed drops away without warning, forcing divers and caisson crews to work at the edge of the unknown. Every shift began with the tides. Currents here run between 6 and 10 knots, strong enough to drag a man off his feet or sweep a barge sideways in seconds. The window for underwater work was measured in minutes, not hours. Miss the slack tide, and the job became impossible or lethal. Above the surface, the air offered no relief. Wind rips through the strait, funneled by the cliffs into a steady roar. Official logs recorded gusts as high as 61 miles per hour. On the towers, a sudden blast could send a rivet bucket spinning or tear a scaffold loose. The bridge's own early warning system was a whistle. When the wind topped 30 miles per hour, work crews scrambled to secure tools and brace themselves against the steel. Fog was the silent threat. The Golden Gate is shrouded in dense, wet mist, an average of 83 days each year. Sometimes visibility dropped to less than 100 feet, enough to erase the horizon and leave men working in a world of gray. Orders shouted from the deck could vanish into the murk, and the safety net below, stretched like a lifeline, became invisible. On those mornings, a single misstep could mean falling without hope of rescue. The strait's extremes shaped every decision. Engineers and foremen watched the weather as closely as the work schedule, knowing that a sudden change could halt progress or claim lives. The men on the bridge faced not just the challenge of building across open water, but the constant reminder that nature here was indifferent to ambition. Each day began with a calculation: how much risk could be taken before the strait claimed another name for its toll? Steel, stone, and wire alone do not explain the scale of what rose above the Golden Gate. Each tower stands 746 feet, a height that, in the 1930s, rivaled the tallest skyscrapers in America. To plant these giants, engineers ordered caissons 70 feet across, wider than most city streets, and sank them into a seabed that dropped away without warning. Divers worked in pitch black, bracing steel plates against currents that could rip a man loose in seconds. Above, the towers climbed higher than the fog itself, their red skeletons visible for miles when the mist parted. The bridge's main cables are a feat almost beyond belief. Each cable is over 3 feet thick, but their true strength comes from within. 27,572 individual wires spun together across the strait. Laid end to end, these wires would circle the Earth more than 3 times. Every strand was hand-pulled and clamped by men working on a narrow catwalk hundreds of feet above the bay, with only a few planks and the open sky beneath them. The anchorages at either end are not just blocks of concrete, they are fortresses, each holding back the full weight of the suspended roadway and the constant pull of the wind. These foundations had to be poured in short windows, timed to the tides and the mercy of the weather. If the concrete set too slowly or the forms shifted, the entire structure could be lost. The numbers are staggering. Over 80,000 tons of steel, more than 600,000 rivets per tower, and a deck stretching 4,200 feet from shore to shore. Yet scale alone did not make this bridge dangerous. It was the combination of size, exposure, and the relentless pace demanded by the project's financing. The sheer magnitude required hundreds of men to work at once on scaffolds, in caissons, on cables, each one exposed to the elements, each one a single slip away from disaster. The bridge's grandeur was inseparable from its risk. Every measurement on the blueprints translated to a new hazard, a new demand on human strength and nerve. This was not just construction, it was a daily trial at the edge of what was possible, where the beauty of the design existed side by side with the ever-present threat of loss. 1,000 men gathered at the edge of the continent, drawn from cities and farms across the country. The Great Depression had closed factories, emptied pockets, and left bread lines stretching for blocks. For many, the Golden Gate Bridge was not just a job, it was a last shot at dignity and survival. The pay, $8 or $9 a day, stood out in a world where 1 in 5 Americans was out of work. It was enough to feed a family, pay a mortgage, or send a few dollars home. The risk, though, was as real as the steel they handled. The crews reflected the restless tide of America in the 1930s. Irish and Italian immigrants made up the core of the iron workers and riveters, men whose fathers had built the railroads and whose own hands were already marked by years of high steel work. Alongside them, Mexican and Filipino laborers took on the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs, hauling timber, mixing concrete, clearing debris. Some were just boys, barely 18, with no trade but a willingness to climb. Unions were the backbone of this workforce. The International Association of Bridge, Structural, Ornamental, and Reinforcing Iron Workers, known simply as the Iron Workers, set the rules on pay and hours. Their meeting minutes, still preserved today, read like a ledger of hardship and resolve. Overtime was common, especially as the schedule tightened and the threat of missing a bond payment loomed over everyone. The Union Hall became a place where men swapped stories of close calls, lobbied for safer gear, and sometimes grieved together when a name disappeared from the roll. The Depression made the danger almost beside the point. For a steady wage, men would step out onto beams slick with fog, hundreds of feet above water so cold it could stop the heart in minutes. They worked with little more than leather harnesses and a few lines run between girders. Every morning a man might kiss his wife goodbye and wonder if he'd see her again. The bridge's payroll ledgers show the churn, men hired, men gone, sometimes replaced by a brother or a cousin willing to take the same risk. The promise of the bridge was more than a paycheck. It offered a kind of pride, a chance to be part of something bigger than any one man. Yet the price was always there, unspoken but understood. 30 men would pay with their lives before the last rivet was hammered home, a number that echoes through every pay stub and union badge left behind. The beauty of the Golden Gate Bridge is inseparable from the hardship and sacrifice of those who built it. For the men on the cables and catwalks, the structure was never just steel and paint. It was a test of endurance, a gamble for a better future, and for too many, the end of the line. Work on the Golden Gate Bridge began with a descent into darkness. On January 5, 1933, crews lowered the first of 2 steel caissons into the strait, each a hollow cylinder 70 feet across and open at the bottom. These caissons would anchor the towers, but before any steel could rise above the water, men had to go below it, into a world few had seen, and even fewer would survive. Diving at the Golden Gate was a job for the desperate or the fearless. The water at the south anchorage drops more than 200 feet, cold and black, with currents that could yank a man off his line in seconds. Divers worked blind, guided by touch alone, threading steel plates into place and blasting away silt with high-pressure hoses. The only safe window was the slack tide, a brief 30 to 45 minutes when the ocean's pull eased just enough to make the work possible. Every minute outside that window risked disaster. On January 24, 1934, the bridge claimed its first life. The victim was a caisson diver, name lost in some records, but his fate is written in the coroner's report, drowned while water blasting the caisson's base. According to the dive log, he had descended to nearly 200 feet, fighting both the pressure and the cold. His airline snagged as the tide began to shift. Within moments, the current surged, pinning him against the steel shell. The surface crew tried to haul him up, but the line went slack. When they finally pulled him out, it was too late. The death sent a chill through the workforce. The bridge was still little more than blueprints and ambition, but already the cost was being paid in flesh and blood. The caisson logs from that week show a halt in underwater work, a rare pause in a project that measured time in dollars and deadlines. Men gathered on the barge deck, staring at the water that had swallowed one of their own, knowing it could just as easily be them. The coroner's findings were blunt. Cause of death, drowning. Contributing factors, strong current and delayed rescue. There were no safety divers, no backup air tanks, no modern communication gear. The diver's suit was heavy canvas, his helmet brass and glass, his lifeline a single rope leading to the surface. In 1934, this was the best protection technology could offer. Yet the bridge could not wait. The caisson was cleared and work resumed with the next slack tide. Men returned to the depths, driven by the promise of a paycheck and the knowledge that quitting meant hunger at home. Their only defense was experience and luck. Above them, the city watched as the towers began to rise, unaware that the foundation of the Golden Gate Bridge rested on more than concrete and steel. It rested on the lives of men willing to risk everything, and on the memory of the first who never came back from the deep. The first fatality would not be the last. But it forced a question that hung over every shift. How many more names would the Strait claim before the bridge was done? Steel for the towers arrived by barge, stacked in hulking piles at the water's edge. The first challenge was getting these massive truss sections off the ground and into place, hundreds of feet above the swirling strait. Without modern cranes, crews relied on a system as risky as it was ingenious: the spool and spit hoist. Men cranked heavy cables through hand-operated winches, inching each steel piece up vertical rails bolted to the growing skeleton of the tower. The process demanded raw strength and perfect timing. A single slip, a snag in the cable, or a sudden change in wind could turn a routine lift into a disaster. On February 12, 1934, the wind didn't just shift, it attacked. The foreman's weather log clocked gusts at 45 miles per hour. Steel trusses swayed like pendulums, and every man on the tower felt the structure shudder beneath his boots. That morning, an unnamed truss placer, one of the men who guided steel into position, lost his footing. There was no harness, no net, nothing but open air between him and the rocks far below. He fell, vanishing into the roar of the wind and the white churn of the water. The crew froze. The work stopped for less than an hour, just long enough for the coroner to record the second fatality in the project's log. The men who returned to the tower that afternoon did so with hands that shook. They knew the spool and spit system was unforgiving. Every ascent meant hauling steel through a gauntlet of wind and fog, trusting that the next truss wouldn't slip or the cable wouldn't snap. The height was more than a number. It was a living threat, a force that pressed on nerves and muscles, making each step a test of nerve. The bridge was rising, but so was the toll. Each new story of the tower added another layer of risk, and another reminder that the beauty of the Golden Gate came at the price of lives lost in silence, high above the bay. The need for better protection grew impossible to ignore, but for now, the men still worked with nothing but courage and luck between themselves and the abyss. Joseph Strauss had watched too many men fall to their deaths on bridge projects. In 1934, as the Golden Gate's towers rose into the fog, he insisted on something no American bridge had tried before: a safety net stretched beneath the entire roadway. The cost, $200,000, sparked heated debate. That sum could buy a mile of steel or months of wages, but Strauss and Chief Engineer Irving Morrow argued the net could save lives. The engineering committee's minutes record the arguments. Some directors called it wasteful, others feared it would slow the pace. But the numbers were stark. Without the net, projections suggested up to 200 deaths before completion. With it, the toll could be slashed. The net itself was a feat of engineering. Woven from 24-inch steel mesh 16 feet deep, it hung from the towers and main cables, trailing 10 feet past the deck on each side. Massive steel hooks anchored it in place. Designed to catch a man falling from as high as 70 feet, it offered a last chance in a world where a slip usually meant the end. For the first time, there was something between a worker and the abyss. The first real test came quickly. On March 3, 1934, Joe Baird, a wiry ironworker from the Midwest, lost his footing while guiding a rivet bucket along the East Anchorage truss. He plunged nearly 70 feet, disappearing into the gray. The net caught him, sagging under his weight but holding. Baird broke his ribs and leg, but he lived. News spread fast. The net worked. Over the next 2 years, 18 more men would survive falls, each one inducted into the Halfway to Hell Club, a name that captured the strange luck of survival. They had fallen, but not all the way. The net changed the mood on the bridge. Some foremen worried it might make men reckless, but for most, it was a lifeline. Danger still hung over every shift, wind, fog, and the ever-present drop. But now, for a lucky few, the bridge's risks were no longer always fatal. Heat and cold traded places on the bridge, But danger was constant. Every morning men climbed into the fog, boots slipping on wet steel, hands already numb from the wind. The portable furnaces that dotted the deck glowed orange, heating rivets to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Bill Hennessy, a wiry iron worker from Oakland, worked the furnace line through the worst of it. His job was to grab the glowing rivets with tongs, toss them to the bucket on the beam, and pray the wind didn't whip the red-hot metal into open air or into a man's face. On May 12, 1935, the wind howled at 55 miles per hour, rattling every plank and cable. The official log recorded it as just another day. For Bill, it was a test of nerve. The gusts could rip a bucket from your grip or send a man tumbling. He remembered the way the fog swallowed the towers, hiding the net below. Sometimes you couldn't see your own boots. The water far beneath looked black and bottomless. Every step was a bet that the steel would hold, that no sudden blast would knock you sideways, that your hand wouldn't slip on a slick girder. Men shouted orders into the mist, voices lost before they crossed the next span. The heat from the furnace was a small comfort, but it brought its own threat. A dropped rivet could burn through a glove in seconds. One misaimed toss, and the man catching it might be left with a permanent scar. The safety net was there, but on days when the wind screamed, it felt like a thin hope. Bill had seen a man fall, arms pinwheeling, and vanish into the gray. Sometimes the net caught them, sometimes it didn't. The third fatality came on a day much like this, hidden by fog, claimed by the strait. Bill kept working, hands blistered, nerves frayed, never sure if his name would be next on the list. For every man on the bridge, the stress was unrelenting. The beauty of the structure was something seen from a distance. Up close, it was a daily grind of sweat, fear, and the knowledge that one mistake could mean a family left waiting at home. The death tally kept rising, each name a reminder that the price of progress was paid in flesh and blood. A man's name appears in the coroner's ledger, March 3, 1934. The entry is spare, occupation riveter, cause fall from cable platform, weather wind at 30 miles per hour, fog rolling in. No family listed, no next of kin. He slipped from the cable splicing platform, vanished into the gray. The safety net, just weeks old, caught him. He survived, battered but alive. A rare reprieve. That day the tally did not rise, but the ledger would not stay quiet for long. October 7, 1935. Light fog covered the span as iron workers guided a decklift winch across the unfinished roadway. One man, working the catwalk, lost his balance. The net was there, but this time he missed it by inches. The coroner's report notes the fall as instantaneous. His body was pulled from the water hours later, after the tide had turned. The Bridge District's safety log recorded the incident as unavoidable, a word that would echo through the months ahead. For the men who watched him fall, it was a reminder that luck and steel mesh could only do so much. The bridge pressed on, and the roll call at the Union Hall grew shorter by one. January 14, 1936. The wind tore through the towers at 57 miles per hour, howling across the exposed steel. A crane operator high above the bay fought to keep his load steady. The gusts twisted the cable, wrenching the crane sideways. The accident happened fast. A steel beam swung out of control. The operator thrown from his perch. He fell hundreds of feet, disappearing into the whitecaps below. The official record lists the cause as equipment collapse, weather contributing. The crew paused only long enough to recover what they could, then returned to the work, hands shaking, eyes fixed on the steel. Each death was met with a brief silence, a moment where the hammering and shouting stopped. Then the project resumed, as if nothing had happened. Paychecks were still due, deadlines still loomed. The bridge's beauty grew above the fog, but beneath it the cost mounted, one name at a time. The men who fell were rarely remembered beyond a line in a report, a whispered story at the end of a shift, yet every loss was felt. 30 men would die before the bridge opened, most of them unnamed in the city's celebrations. Their stories are hidden in the margins, coroner's notes, union minutes, a family's unanswered letter. The bridge's rise was measured not just in feet and steel, but in the toll exacted from those who built it. Each fatal fall was a private disaster, overshadowed by the public marvel taking shape above the strait. At 9:12 on the morning of February 28, 1937, the North Tower was alive with the sound of hammers and the hiss of hot rivets. 12 men balanced on a timber scaffold, 250 feet above the churning water, focused on the day's rivet run. Among them were the Riley brothers, Thomas, the foreman, and Michael, a steelman. Both veterans of high iron work, both familiar with the way the wind could turn steel into a living thing. The scaffold creaked under the weight of men, tools, and a portable forge. The air was thick with fog, the kind that muffles sound and hides everything but your own hands. The bridge's anemometer, bolted to the tower's steel ribs, recorded a gust at 60 miles per hour. The wind struck like a fist, sending a shudder through the scaffold. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a sharp crack split the morning, the sound of a bolt shearing under strain. The upper bracket, meant to anchor the platform to the tower, gave way. The entire structure lurched sideways, and in a sickening chain reaction, the remaining bolts failed one by one. Timber beams, steel planks, and men tumbled together in a cascade of noise and splintered wood. The safety net, stretched beneath the roadway, had saved so many before. But the scaffold's weight, 30 tons of wood and steel, was too much. The net sagged, tore, and let the wreckage punch through. 8 men struck the net, their falls arrested for a heartbeat before the massive debris dragged them down. 2 were crushed instantly. 2 more missed the net entirely, vanishing into the gray water below. The rest clung to whatever fragments they could grasp, battered by falling timbers and the shock of the sudden drop. On the deck, shouts turned to screams as workers scrambled to throw lines and lower lifeboats. The rescue crew moved fast, but the bay was unforgiving. The water, barely above 50 degrees, sapped strength in seconds. For the men who fell clear, survival depended on how quickly they could be reached. For most, it was already too late. Coroner's reports later listed 10 dead, riveters, laborers, brothers. The Riley family lost both Thomas and Michael that day. Their names joined the others in the bridge's fatality ledger, but for their families, the loss was immediate and raw. The scaffold collapse was the deadliest single moment in the entire project, a disaster that shattered the illusion of safety and left scars that would never fully heal. The investigation traced the failure to a combination of high wind, overloaded timber, and bolts that could not withstand the sudden force. Official recommendations called for all future scaffolds to be designed for 70-mile-an-hour gusts and for timber to be replaced with steel. But for the men who watched their friends fall, no regulation could erase the memory of that morning. The bridge pressed on, but the cost was now impossible to ignore. The beauty of the Golden Gate would forever be shadowed by the lives lost in its making. Today, millions cross the bridge without seeing the scars beneath its beauty. The price was not just dollars or steel, but 30 lives, each with a name, a family, a future cut short. Their sacrifice warns us, progress built on invisible suffering isn't progress at all. As cities chase ever-grand designs, we must decide if monuments will honor ambition or remember the human cost that still echoes below. Share your thoughts on what this legacy means today.